T. Matheny, Jr., Ed, at his home in Kansas City, Missouri on August the 20th, 2004. Ed served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. His highest rank was Lieutenant J.G. He was an operations officer on the SINPAC staff of the Navy in the Pacific. That's the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Operation for the Navy. Ed was born July the 15th, 1923, and he served from September 15th, 1942 to June of 1946, nearly 4 years. He's the holder of the Asiatic Pacific Medal, the Japanese Occupation Medal, the Victory Medal, and I'm sure he got a Good Conduct Medal. Ed, where did you grow up as a kid?
Kansas City, Missouri. I've lived here all of my life from age 6 months until the present time, except for being away in college and the Navy.
So, Ed, if 6 months, you must have, where were you prior to the coming here?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois.
Chicago, and you came down to Kansas City when you were 6 months old.
In the company of my parents, yes.
Always a good idea at that age. Tell me about your mom, dad. What was your daddy's name?
Well, he was Edward T. Matheny.
Senior?
Senior.
Yes.
And he was born in Illinois. He came from a little town in southern Illinois called Newton. I've rarely found anybody from Illinois that's ever heard of Newton. My mother was from a little town in southern Iowa, Milton, Iowa, and I've rarely found anybody from the state of Iowa that's ever heard of Milton.
What was your mother's maiden name?
Pennell.
Pennell?
P-E-N-N-E-L-L.
And first name?
Lina.
Lina Pennell.
Lina Pennell.
Southern Iowa. And she and your dad married in Chicago and then had you, and you came down to Kansas City. What did your daddy do for a living to feed his family back then?
He was a salesman. He sold life insurance. He worked for New York Life Insurance Company. And later he was a manufacturer's representative, and he sold a line of woodworking machinery.
So he's a peddler in one form or another all his life.
And of course, I grew up during the Depression, and I know that those have to have been tough times for my dad and my mother, but you never knew it. He and she never let my sister and I know that things were hard. In retrospect, I think of them as pretty heroic people because of the way that they raised us.
So there was a sister. So brother, sister means you and a sister. What's her name, and was she older or younger than you?
She's younger, about a year and a half. Her name's Betty. She's married to a guy named Earl Stark, who was also in the Navy. They now live in Florida.
And so your dad was a salesman, making a living. Do you have a military history in your family, Ed, before you, like either your father in World War I or somebody maybe in the Revolution, the Civil War or other wars?
Unfortunately, as far as my antecedents, I don't know. I suspect that there was probably that, except for my father. I do know that he joined the Marine Corps and went to France with the Marines in 1917, and at the age of 27, and got out, of course, after the war ended, and he married my mother then, and they lived in Chicago before they came here.
Did you ever, as a kid, knowing that your dad had been in the Marines during World War I, did you ever ask Dad, what'd you do in the Marines? Did you ever have a conversation about that?
I really never did. He didn't. He obviously took great pride in the fact that he'd been a Marine. He mentioned being in France. I don't even know what he did in France. He was with the 5th Brigade of the Marines, and we have on the wall a framed copy of his honorable discharge, the certificate, which I found among his effects and had framed.
Mm. Was your mother stay-at-home mom
Yes.
while he was out selling,
My
probably on the
mom
road?
was a
And
stay-at-home mom, and it was kind of the old-fashioned family arrangement in that respect. I do want to say something about the Boy Scouts, because my dad was active with the Boy Scouts, and I ultimately was an Eagle Scout. But I could still recite today the Scout Oath, Scout Law, Scout Motto, those things. And I went to the Boy Scout camp in Osceola, Missouri. And I can remember at night when it was time for us to hit the sack, they would put on a record of Kate Smith singing God Bless America. And I remember that coming out over the parade ground. This would have been, I'd have been early teens. And here I could still tell you that how that begins as a storm of clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. And I remembered that.
Thanks for reciting it. I'll not ask you to sing it, though I know you could. That is absolutely wonderful. Now, that Boy Scout camp has been down there, in my mind, forever. But when did it really start down there? Because if you were there 70 years ago, 65 years ago, had it been there long? Do you know?
Yes, it had been there, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years before I got there. They had just, they had great pride in the fact that they had just built a swimming pool. They used to swim in the river, in the Osage River, and by the time I got there, they had a swimming pool.
Well, legions, virtually thousands of young men from Kansas, Missouri, from this part of our great city have gone down there, and it's influenced the lives of many. So that was great to have that little vignette from your experience down there. Where'd you go to grade school?
Hale H. Cook at 73rd and Penn. I grew up at 71st and Penn.
What was your address? 71?
7121 Penn.
And so you just walked a block down the street and you were at school?
A couple blocks south.
Yeah, a couple
on
blocks
Penn
south.
Street, and I was in school.
And what high school did you go to then?
Southwest High School, and that was on Warnell Road, about 65th. And again, a lot of the time I walked. It was a pretty good hike, but in those days, kids either walked or rode bicycles. Now and then they'd catch a ride. I'd catch a ride with my dad now and then if it happened to coincide with his having to go by the school.
And you graduated from Southwest High School?
I graduated in 1940.
1940.
Class of 40. And I went to the University of Missouri. I had a basketball scholarship. And I played basketball at the university. My sophomore year was Pearl Harbor, and we had a great trip lined up to go by train to the West Coast, play Washington, Washington State, California, Gonzaga, and the University of Idaho. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, my big concern was, will they call off the basketball trip?
And they probably did.
No, they did not.
They didn't.
So we took the train, and I remember on the West Coast, there was great consternation. Didn't know quite what to expect there. They were setting up machine guns on office buildings.
So you went to University of Missouri as a freshman. Back then you couldn't play ball, but you did as a sophomore,
Right.
and made the team, and I suppose did well.
Well, I like to
Did
think
you have
so.
a good record? I mean, the team.
Well, we did okay, and that trip was probably symptomatic. We beat California, and we beat Gonzaga, and we lost the other 3 games. I remember that.
So what was the impetus for? Had you always been, in your own mind, college bound? And what created that impetus for it? Was it a teacher? Was it your mom, your dad? Did you have a family, a sense of the need to get an education?
Well, my family, of course. My dad went 1 year to the University of Wisconsin before the family ran out of money. And it never occurred to me that I would not be going to college. And had a lot of wonderful teachers who encouraged that in
Yeah.
my family.
Well, at that time, not too many got to go to college, so it was wonderful that you had that push that got you there. You went to University of Missouri. Freshman couldn't play ball, but I'm sure you did well in school. Sophomore, you got to play ball, which was terrific, and you still did well in school, I'm sure. At what point did you, where were you when Pearl Harbor happened, December 7th, 1941, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, as I was in Columbia, and as I said, I remember we were all sitting around. I was in a fraternity, and we all sat around that Sunday and listened to the news on the radio there, and didn't have television. As I recall, that was Atwater Kent radio in those days. So there was, everybody was wondering, but they, for the most part at the university, they encouraged you to stay in school. University of Missouri, I might mention, was a land-grant college, which meant ROTC was compulsory for freshmen and sophomores. But we didn't take it very seriously until Pearl Harbor was bombed my sophomore year, and then all of a sudden we started taking it very seriously.
Did it hit you, not that day necessarily, but in the next few days, hey, I'm 18 years old, our country's at war, it looks like I'm going to be a part of it. Did that occur to you? I mean,
Yes,
in a big way?
all of us, it occurred to us. Can you turn?
And by the way, that tap, tap, tap that we hear irregularly is somebody doing some remodeling work next door.
That's correct, and
But-
we're kind of stuck with that.
Yes, we're stuck with it. So Pearl Harbor, it occurred to you, looks like I and my friends, we all knew that we were going to be going to war. So at what point in time did you then develop a relationship with the Navy that saw them own you to be a cadet later on?
Well, as I said, we started to take ROTC very seriously because that was an opportunity to be an officer as opposed to an enlisted man. But I went to a movie, and it was a big Marine Corps movie. And I thought, gee whiz, that looks good to me. So I went to a Marine Corps recruiting station and learned that I couldn't pass the eye exam, which gave me all the more incentive to find something else. And I had a friend who was in the recruiting office for the Navy in Kansas City. So I went there and signed on with their V7 program.
Mm-hmm. And the V7 program at that time, if the Navy could deal with it, it would allow you to finish school and then go into the officer candidate program.
That is correct. They had V12, which was a version where you wore a uniform and were part of an organized group, and I'm sure you've had some of those. V5 were guys who were going into naval aviation. V7 was for deck officers, but you were allowed to continue, for a time at least, your education. And I knew my time would be limited, and I went to summer school, and they finally decided that they sent out a word that if you were going to be graduating within the next semester, then you could end your college education, you could graduate. And I qualified for that and graduated early in December of 1943.
Mm-hmm. I think they actually graduated you with still having a course or two to complete, did they not?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
They did. They said that those were minor requirements.
Sure.
And I did. I was fortunate enough to have been elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and I think they took that into account.
Sure, I'm sure they did. So you graduated in December of 44, and now you're going away to the Navy. Where did you go to a Navy officer training?
Plattsburgh, New York. I sat around for a couple of months waiting for the word to come, and they finally sent a very terse message come to Plattsburgh, and that was, we were the first Navy class in Plattsburgh, and there were only two. That had been an Army training facility ever since World War I.
And that's way up north, isn't it?
On Lake Champlain, about 20 miles south of the Canadian line.
And this was January.
Well, this actually, it was the 1st of March.
1st of March, cold in the middle of winter, though.
Oh, and how, that lake was frozen over, and I can remember when we lined up on outside the mess hall for chow wearing those little short Navy pea jackets, how cold that wind was coming off Lake Michigan, or Lake Champlain about, well, it was still dark in the morning.
How many classes of Navy ensigns graduated from Plattsburgh?
Just two
Two.
classes. And the idea was, by then, they needed to train people for amphibious duty, and here they were on Lake Champlain, and they had small boat training, and it was at a time when they needed to replace people who were being killed on invasions in the islands in the Pacific, and and in fact, most of my class did go on to man LSTs and LCIs and other amphibious craft.
And do you remember the day, even though you'd been away to school for some time down at Columbia, Missouri, at the University of Missouri, do you remember the day that you kissed your mama goodbye and shook your daddy's hand and went away to war, went away to Plattsburgh? Was that an emotional time?
Yes, it was, but it was more emotional with them in particular when I came back on my way to Pearl Harbor, because I was given about 7 days leave time, and I stopped off in Kansas City. And I can remember when they took me down to the Union Station to board the Santa Fe Chief to go west to San Francisco. They saw me off at the station. My dad had a proud smile as an ex-Marine, but my mother was smiling, but her eyes were kind of watery too. So that was, I recall that.
And did you, later, when you came back and you were out of harm's way, the war was over, did you ever have a conversation with your parents about how was it for you back here while I was over there?
Not really, but I did write letters home, and they wrote me, so there was an exchange of correspondence, but I don't recall much reminiscing about how it was. I knew how it was for them.
They proudly hung that flag with the one blue star, I bet.
That's right. That was in the window. And they, but I knew from our correspondence, and they knew what I was doing as insofar as I could tell them. There was a lot of censoring, you know, when you wrote letters home, so a lot you couldn't say.
How many were in your class of graduates?
At midshipman school?
Yes.
Several hundred.
Several hundred.
Several hundred.
And they had two classes there. Was there, from the time you began, was there much dropout, fallout, washout?
No, I don't recall that. One fellow I remember was Puerto Rican, named George Padron. And I remember because George had a pronounced accent with his Spanish background, there was some thought being given that maybe they should wash him out. They did not, and I was very glad they did not. I don't know whatever happened when he became an ensign. I hope they gave him an assignment where they could benefit from his Hispanic background, but quite often in the Navy they didn't seem to put the round peg in the round hole.
So you had that stripe on your arm when you graduated. At that time, were parents, relatives, family, friends, would they come to a ceremony where you were initiated as an officer,
I think
sworn in?
there were those people there, but Plattsburgh was a long way from Kansas City, and
Sure.
as a matter of fact, I was not around for my college graduation because I was by then in the Navy, so there was no attendance there, and I was not around. They were not around, my parents, for my Navy.
Mhm. So they gave you a few days off, 7 days, and then you hot-footed it to the West Coast, from which you were going to be shipped out. Is that correct?
Right. There I was awaiting transportation, and there were a lot of people waiting for transportation in those days. So I hung around San Francisco for a few days until I got word to report to an LST in San Pedro. And that was my transportation to the West Coast, and it took 10 days to get there. I mean, to
Were you
Pearl Harbor.
were you in a convoy?
No, we're not in a convoy.
By yourself. Now, an LST is a flat-bottomed ship. You already took a bouncing around, didn't you? How'd you get along in the high sea now? Seasick? Okay?
No, I was lucky. I had a cast iron stomach, and so I never had any seasickness. Of course, as I recall, the seas were fairly calm on that particular trip, and it was 10 days, and I had a nice trip.
I'll bet you saw a few other new junior officers that might have gotten sick.
Well, not on that ship. I think I was about the only one that was not part of ship's company. I think I was the only passenger on that LST.
So you went to Pearl Harbor, and that's where you're going to get your duty assignment.
That's correct.
Which was what?
Well, I was in the assignment was to report to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet for such duties as he gave me, or as they gave me. And when I got to Pearl Harbor, they had an officers' pool, as they called it, and from that they dispatched people for various duties in the Pacific area. And I was told that I was going to be assigned to the staff of Admiral Nimitz and in Flag Plot. I had always wanted to be on a destroyer. I didn't know anything about destroyers. I understood that's where the real sailors were. And but when I told I think this fellow was a lieutenant commander, that I wanted to be on a destroyer, when he told me I was going to sink pack, he said he didn't really give a damn what I wanted. That's where I was going. So that's where I went. And of course, it turned out that was my great good fortune.
That was a great assignment, wasn't it? So so that was SINPAC, and what were you? Probably a big downtown building in
No, it was Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor?
Pearl
Okay,
Harbor.
you were at Pearl Harbor. And what was your job, your specific job?
Down at SINPAC was a great big fortress, if you will. And way underground, they had a great big room where they had a big chart, which was the entire Pacific Ocean area. And on that chart, we kept track of everything. Dispatches would come in, and we would plot the locations of ships, submarines, aircraft if they were down, battles when they were fought. We tracked those, and we also had card files that told where different ships were located. So
Was there a big staff at work at one time down in the plotting area?
No. There would be only one plotting officer that did the job I was doing. But the SINPAC communicators with their dispatches would come and go and give you the information for you to put things on this big chart. And there was a telephone, one of those crank phones, which I was told linked me, if I needed to use it at night, to Admiral Nimitz's bedside.
The version of the red phone, I guess?
I guess. But the occasion never arose where I had to call Admiral Nimitz. There were occasions when the staff duty officer, who was a four-striper, where I'd have to get a hold of him, and he'd have to come in. I never used the phone to call Admiral Nimitz.
To the best of your knowledge, how many ships in 44 did we have in the Pacific Theater of Operations that you were following?
Oh,
Thousands?
Yeah, oh, many thousands.
Many thousands.
And they were wherever they were, all over the ocean. And one of the more interesting occasions, I happened to be on duty when the Battle of Lady Gulf occurred, and I was trying to plot that, and I can remember having elbow aside a lot of top brass who were trying to follow what was going on. Because a picture's worth 1,000 words. They were getting the dispatches, but they wanted to see what the chart reflected on that.
Did you also plot and follow the Japanese fleet?
Yes, well, that was during that engagement, yes, but we did not
Normally
no,
do that.
no, normally just our ships.
Mm-hmm. What was your most interesting experience, if you can think of an interesting experience at that time? Was it the Leyte Gulf? I mean, when
I
things
think so.
really flared up and you had people at your elbows and you had all these ships and we knew where the Japanese ships were?
And of course, I was a young 21-year-old ensign who I didn't fully appreciate the history that was being made at that time. I was putting all this stuff down, but and of course this was the time when the kamikazes first made their appearance, and there was great consternation about that because here were all of a sudden these suicide airplanes diving on our ships, and nobody could really handle that. We didn't know quite what to do, and the Navy had tried to not say much about it in the hope that the Japanese wouldn't realize how effective that was. But of course, it was there for everybody to see. So
Now, the Coral Sea and Midway had already occurred when you took
That's
that
correct.
position, right?
That's correct.
Had Midway already occurred?
Yes, that was
Okay.
in 42.
Okay, so this was over really the last vestiges of the Japanese Navy in the Philippines, and that's where we scuttled the Navy, isn't it?
That's right. After that, the Navy the Japanese Navy ceased to be an effective fighting force after the Philippines.
So what'd you work typically? You had one shift? I mean, an
Yes.
8-hour shift, 9-hour shift, and then there was a fellow officer who did the same thing later?
Right. You'd be around the clock, and if you drew the midwatch, why, just like the midwatch on a ship would be from, as I recall, like 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, and you didn't always have the midwatch. It would just depend on how that rotation worked out for you.
Mm-hmm. And where did you live? Very close by?
There was a BOQ, and it had a nice Hawaiian named Makalapa. And that's where I was. And most of the residents of that BOQ were people who were part of the staff, but there would be also transient officers coming through who were billeted there for one reason or another temporarily.
And were you always on call? I mean,
Yes, but I can't recall ever having to come in except at my normal duty time.
what'd you do when you weren't working?
Well, I'd never been to Hawaii, so I was able to get a hold of a Jeep and drive around the island of Oahu. I can remember going over to Kaneohe, which was a naval air station, to see Hilo Hattie perform. Driving up over the Pali was a great thrill because that was quite a scene from the top of that pass. I played some tennis, swam in the officers' pool, got to see Waikiki Beach and see the ocean. Incidentally, the only time I'd seen the ocean before the Navy was that basketball trip that I referred to, and I didn't get much of a glimpse of it at that time. So my first real view of the ocean was then.
Mm.
Incidentally, my first ride in an airplane too was when by this time I'd transferred to the Fifth Fleet staff, and I was taking a bunch of mine location of Japanese minefields. Got to fly.
Okay, now, as part of the sink back, Admiral Nimitz was in charge of the whole Pacific Fleet. Did you ever have any interaction with him personally?
Only in passing. I can remember, particularly when we got to Guam, then we were much smaller. His advanced headquarters was a much smaller organization.
And you went with his headquarters when they moved from Pearl to Guam.
That's
to be
correct.
closer to the action up north.
That's correct, and that was in January of '45. And it was a smaller group, and I can remember walking from the BOQ there to where I was to Flag Plot, and he'd be out for a morning walk, and he'd say, "Good morning, son," and he'd say, "Good morning, Admiral." But I really didn't have much interchange with him on a professional basis.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice guy, though. Had the respect, I think, of everybody.
Mm-hmm. And what gave him that respect accorded him by other people, other than, let's say, the gingerbread on his shoulder? That'd be some of it, but what kind of a man was he reputed to be?
I think he respected everybody, treated them with respect, and he also made some very good decisions in the course of the war, which were appreciated. He had a lot to do with judgment calls. He mentioned the Battle of Midway. He had a lot to do with the decisions that were made there, and in the early days of the war, he had the right people doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so when you went to Guam, he was still the man in charge.
Oh, yes.
And then you got voluntarily transferred to the Fifth Fleet,
Yeah.
did you not?
I did. I'd always wanted sea duty, and the war was still going on. In fact, we were anticipating the invasion of Japan. I encountered a fellow who was doing for Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet something similar to what I was doing for Nimitz and Sinkpack, although on a much smaller scale. He had an opportunity to be transferred to the West Coast if he could find a suitable replacement, and I said I would like to be your replacement, and so that was arranged. And I can remember his parting comment, "If you get out there and get your rear end blown off, don't blame me." I can remember him saying that. And when I met Admiral Spruance for the first time, I can remember his asking me if I was looking for excitement. I kind of gulped, and I don't recall what I said, but I learned later when the war ended that there would have been a lot of excitement, because I was privy to the operation plans for the invasion of Japan, and if Harry Truman, bless him, hadn't dropped that atom bomb, why, there would have been an awful lot of people killed, not just Fifth Fleet people, but Japanese.
Well, I want to ask your opinion of that a little bit later, because you do have foreknowledge of what was planned. Where was the headquarters of Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet staff?
Well, at the time I joined it, they were
Same place, Guam?
They were on Guam, and they were waiting to board ship. As a matter of fact, they were waiting for the Indianapolis, which was his flagship. Frequently, sometimes it was the Indianapolis, which was a light cruiser. Sometimes it was a battleship like the New Jersey. And they were waiting for the Indianapolis to come back to Guam. It had dropped off the atom bomb on its way to the Philippines, and then coming back from the Philippines, of course, it was a very tragic story. It was sunk, and the people on the Fifth Fleet staff had a lot of friends on the Indianapolis.
Indianapolis was in the Fifth Fleet?
Yes.
part of the Fifth Fleet.
And it was going to be Esperanza's flagship again. But it was sunk, and so we didn't board that.
The Indianapolis brought the atomic bombs to Saipan, is that correct?
Yeah, Tinian, I believe.
Tinian, I'm sorry, Tinian, I didn't mean Saipan.
Yeah, well, there was Marianas
Very close,
Islands, they were all
yes.
close together.
What kind of a fellow was Admiral Spruance?
He was a very fine gentleman, and he was a very careful admiral who, again, made a lot of really good decisions. There were two admirals under CINCPAC who were much in the headlines. One was William Halsey, who had the Third Fleet, affectionately called the Bull, and Admiral Spruance, who was more of a calculator, I guess you might say. And Spruance was, I would see a little more of him because, as I said, it was a smaller staff.
Was your general impression of all of the flag level officers that perhaps you met, that they were all very able, capable, and at least with their subordinates were gentlemen?
Yes, I had the greatest
demanding, but nonetheless gentlemen.
I had the greatest respect for them, and they treated me and others on the staff as you might expect a gentleman like that to behave, and the enlisted men as well. They were fine men.
What evidence, if any, did you see or hear about, Ed, of let's say inter-service rivalry? Because invaded the Philippines, took the Philippines, the Navy was very instrumental of that, and then of course General MacArthur, who was an Army man, said, I've got a reputation, I will return. Did you see any evidence or hearsay maybe of things that were going on at a higher level?
Well, you're aware of the fact that MacArthur and Nimitz didn't always have the same vision of how the war should be fought.
Now, were they peers?
Yes,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
they were. And MacArthur was really operating out of the Southwest Pacific. When he left the Philippines, he went to Australia, and his base was there from then on, whereas Nimitz was coming from the Middle Pacific, moving west. But they were peers, and there were big differences about some things, but they were able to subordinate their views and make common cause against the Japanese.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So from Guam, where were you on April the 12th of 45 when our president, President Roosevelt, died, and you heard about it?
I was on Guam, and I remember that well too, because people on the staff, knowing I was from Kansas City, Harry Truman was from Independence, a suburb of, in effect, of Kansas City, were quite curious to know what I could tell them about this man who was now going to be our commander-in-chief. And I was, having grown up in Kansas City, where in those days the Kansas City Star was pretty much of a Republican newspaper, I had not gotten a very good impression of Harry Truman. So I was pretty dubious about how that was going to turn out. But I, of course, learned later that he was a fine president.
He was a brave man in a very short time, cessating the war as a result of his actions. But Roosevelt was a very popular president, and I'm sure the vets or the people who were serving hated to see him pass away and get this new fellow that nobody knew. Had you ever met Harry Truman as I thought maybe as a scout or?
No, I got to meet him afterward. Because when I became a lawyer, our offices were in the Federal Reserve Bank building, and when Harry Truman came back after the presidency and was waiting for the Truman Library to be built, Harry's offices were also in the Federal Reserve Bank building. We were 1,000, he was 1,100, and I can remember getting on the elevator. This was before the imperial presidency, and he didn't have a big retinue of Secret Service. He'd be all by himself on the elevator, and he'd gotten on at 11, and I'd gotten on at 10, and here the two of us were. And I can remember on one occasion his looking at his watch and saying, "I'm going to be late for lunch. Bess is going to give me hell." So that's when I encountered him.
That's the personal side of leadership.
Yeah.
So when did you leave Guam then? Because I believe you served on some ships preparatory to our invasion of Japan, land invasion.
I was on Guam when the war ended. So the Fifth Fleet was going to be in charge of the naval part of the occupation of Japan. So we boarded the USS New Jersey, which was going to be Spruance's flagship, and very shortly after the war ended.
Okay, so on August the 6th, the day we dropped the first bomb, thanks to Harry's good judgment, you were on Guam.
Correct.
And did you personally know enough about an atomic bomb then to know the power, magnitude of what it would be?
No, we had no idea.
It's hard to visualize that we had dropped one bomb that caused the Japanese so much consternation. Then 3 days later, August the 9th, we did the same thing on Nagasaki. And then just a few days later, they capitulated. What was it like when you heard the Japanese have surrendered?
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
And I had, because the invasion was going to be in large measure a Fifth Fleet operation, I had some familiarity with the op orders and with what was anticipated in the way of casualties.
Would you share that with me, if you would, Ed, because we know about what happened, but we don't know what was going to happen and the extent of what was going to happen.
Well, we knew that having seen the kamikaze mentality, we knew that invasion forces would be hit before they ever landed by all kinds of suicide missions. And we knew that once they were on shore, that Japanese, not just soldiers and sailors, but women and children, were going to be on suicide missions to kill our invading troops. And we knew that not only our own people, but untold numbers of Japanese would also die as a result of that.
Did you ever see an estimate on the part of the armed forces about how many people would lose their lives? Because they obviously did that. But did you have any?
Well, I think we anticipated we were talking in terms of the millions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because the Japanese were not going to give up, and of course we were going to overwhelm them like we had up to that time.
Yes, that's right. And it was quite different, the occupation, because once the emperor said the war's over, the war was over.
Mm-hmm. So what was your role then in the occupation? You're still at Guam when the war ends, and I'm sure there's a big party that night, maybe for a night or two, and then you got about the business of doing what needed to be done to help rebuild Japan. Where'd you go and what'd you do?
Well, we boarded, the Fifth Fleet staff boarded the New Jersey as our flagship, and set sail for Tokyo Bay.
Was the New Jersey a battleship?
Yes, the USS New Jersey was one of the so-called fast battleships. There were 4 in that class. One was the Missouri, where the surrender ceremony occurred. One was the Iowa, and one was the Wisconsin. So there were these 4 battleships.
You never saw the surrender personally,
No.
though you have good friends who witnessed it, and
Yes.
I believe you have some pictures from a very well-known photographer.
Yes, but the surrender occurred while we were en route to Japan, and I know Spruance was not present at that ceremony, and we wondered why, whether it was his choice or whether that was deemed the best way to do it. But on our way to Tokyo Bay, we stopped off in the Philippines, and I was assigned the duty of picking up charts of the Japanese minefields. So I was detached from the Fifth Fleet staff. I was assigned a Marine Staff Sergeant. I remember him. His name was Broadnax. And we were to have reproduce these charts and then catch up with the New Jersey at Okinawa. So we got the charts and we boarded a PBY, one of those flying boats, and I'd never been in an airplane before. So that was a great thrill for me to fly from Manila to Buckner Bay, Okinawa on my first airplane ride, and the pilot found out I'd never been in a plane before, and he let me fly the plane. It was not all I was supposed to do was keep it in trim and hold the
You didn't land it.
hold the plane nose level with the horizon, which I found to be kind of a workout, although he kind of did it with his little finger. But anyway, we rejoined the New Jersey and Okinawa and went on to Japan from there. And on the way, once we got to Japan, we stopped off at a little town called Wakanura, because it had been an embarkation point assigned for released prisoners of war, and so we had kind of an inspection visit to Wakanura. I went ashore with 3 senior officers, and the Allied forces had just landed there for the first time about 3 days before. We didn't know quite what our reception was going to be, and I don't think the Japanese knew quite what to make of us, so that was an interesting experience. Then we went on to Tokyo Bay.
These were American boys who'd been liberated by our troops.
POWs, that's correct.
They were glad to see you.
Well,
they were glad to see any American.
We really didn't get very close to them because they were already. We did pass a hospital ship that had a lot of them on board. I've forgotten which hospital ship it was, but Admiral Spruance had the band come up, and when we went by them, the band played, and I remember them cheering from the hospital ship, and I remember our people cheering from aboard the New Jersey.
That was great. And so how long did you spend in Japan then, in the waters of Japan, before they finally said, Ed, you're going home?
Well, we got there in September, early September, and we were there until the following March. And then by that time, Fifth Fleet flagship had been changed from the New Jersey to the Iowa, so we went home on the Iowa.
So you came home on the flagship, you and the other officers.
Fifth Fleet flagship, yes.
And
Spruance was not there anymore. I've forgotten who was the Fifth Fleet commander by that time.
And then you came home. Where did you get discharged?
San Diego. We first came to Long Beach, and there we changed flagships from the Iowa to the Vicksburg, which was a heavy cruiser. The Vicksburg went, after sitting around in Long Beach for a little while, went down to San Diego, and that's where I was when I received the orders for detachment and to come home.
Mm-hmm. What, looking back on it, if you can think of an incident, what was your most profound experience? That's difficult because it's too philosophical, but what was your biggest experience that you had during that period of time that maybe made the most profound effect on you?
Well, there were so many. I think one I've already mentioned, even though I didn't realize the significance at the time, was being in Flag Plot when the Lady landings were occurring and plotting that. I think another was, as I also mentioned, being on Guam when we got the word that President Roosevelt had died and was being, and that there was a new man in charge, and I think the third was getting the word of the atomic bomb being dropped and the consequences, namely that the war was over.
Well, you got back and you got discharged. Hey, you'd been plucked out of the new officers to have a very important assignment. I mean, that is to say, working on the head man's staff, doing important work, and you stayed with that all during the war. Did you give any thought to staying in the Navy?
No, I didn't. I mentioned that I had a lot of respect for the professional Navy people that I was associated with, but while I was in Hawaii, I roomed with a couple of gentlemen who had law degrees, and they encouraged me to think about going to law school. And so I made application to the Harvard Law School and was fortunate enough to be accepted. And when I got out of the Navy after a couple of months, I went back to Cambridge in the fall of 1946. And
46, and when did you get out of law school then? 49?
In June of 1949.
And were your designs at that time, I'm hot-footing it back to Kansas City, where my home is?
I thought some about, I never thought seriously about New York. Some of my classmates were there. I went down. I didn't particularly want to practice law there. I thought seriously about Washington. I had a job offer there. I thought about the West Coast, Seattle, because I enjoyed what I'd seen of it on that basketball trip. But I finally determined that I would be better off coming back to the old hometown, and I never had occasion to regret that decision.
Mm-hmm. So, how have you fed your family? You came back here after 1949, and how long did you start a single practice, or did you join a firm? And tell me about up to today.
I joined the firm that I am still associated with. It had a different name at the time. It was then called Caldwell, Downing, Noble and Garrity, and they were in the Federal Reserve Bank building. I referred to that fact at the time. Later it became Blackwell, Sanders, Matheny, Weary, and Lombardi. Went through several name evolutions. I became part of the three-man executive committee that was in charge of the firm. And then I retired in 1992, about 10 years ago. The firm then merged with a St. Louis firm, and the name became Blackwell, Sanders, Pieper Martin, because I was a Pieper Martin firm in St. Louis. I've been lucky in that I've lived the last 20-some years in Crown Center, and the firm's office has been virtually right across the
So
street.
you walk to work?
Well, this sounds kind of dissolute. I really don't. I drive. But the reason for it, on occasion I walk, but I frequently need the car for various and sundry meetings.
So you're retired in 92. You're obviously still maintain an office and go to the office, and you do your boards and your volunteer work out of your office over there. So that would have been like from 50 to 92, 43 years with the very same firm. How many attorneys were with the Blackwell Sanders version when you got started back in 1949?
Good question. There were 10. And the man, R.B. Caldwell, who was the kind of the rainmaker, as they call it now, with the firm, was convinced that 10 was the optimum number of people to have in a law firm, and that they could then turn away business that they didn't really want and take the best. And so as long as he was running the show, that was it. I was the 10th guy hired, and it continued to be a 10-man law firm until after R.B. Caldwell was gone. And of course, since then, it's grown enormously. Now it's well over 300 lawyers.
Well over 300 lawyers here in town. That's
Not
amazing.
just in town.
Oh, okay.
There's an office in St. Louis, an office in Omaha, an office in Springfield, an office in, well, there's even an office in London now. So it's all over the place.
Ed, what was when you practiced law for those 43 years, what was your, quote, specialty?
Well, when I started out, there was no such thing as a specialty because everybody did everything. And I tried cases, and I wrote wills, I handled divorces. Nothing was too important or too insignificant for me to do. Later, I developed, I did a lot of corporate work, and I also did a lot of labor law work representing companies, which was kind of interesting because that was a new area of interest, and the firm didn't really have a labor lawyer, and that's what I became. Which I didn't even take labor law. When I was in Harvard Law School, they had a course in it. The professor was a fellow who was a new man, and there was some skepticism about what kind of a professor he would be. I later had cause to regret that because his name was Archibald Cox, and Archibald Cox later became well known and famous.
Yeah, he did all right for himself, didn't he?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that was a wonderful career, and of course you're still around it all day, every day, so you can enjoy some of the benefits of being around it without doing the work.
The firm's been very kind to me in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's wonderful. Tell me about your family. Now, when you met your first wife who passed away, sadly, what was her name? And when?
Her name was Marion Shields, and we were married when I was in law school. And
was she a Kansas City girl?
Yes, she was.
Where did you meet her?
My sister arranged a blind date with her.
Well, did sparks fly right away, or did it take a little while?
It took a while, I think, but then she, as you've indicated, she passed away and about a year later I married my current wife, and we've been married for some 20
some years.
plus years.
Well, that's wonderful.
So I'm very fortunate in both marriages.
That's wonderful. How about your children, grandchildren?
I have, of course, I now think of them, we both think of them
Sure.
as ours.
Yeah, absolutely.
From my first marriage, two, a daughter Nancy, who lives in Easton, Pennsylvania, and has a daughter, my granddaughter, or our granddaughter, Katie, and a son, Ed, who lives right here, and works at he's a lawyer, he works at the Missouri Court of Appeals, and he's married to a charming lady named D.J. Hyde. And Ann's, now our children of hers, 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and 7 grandchildren. 4 of them we enjoy very much because they live right here in Kansas City, and 3 of them who live back in New Jersey. So our extended family is great. We've got 8 delightful grandchildren and 6 children in our extended family.
That's wonderful. We want to get some pictures of them in a minute, but let's. You wrote a book about your experiences called "The Pursuit of a Ruptured Duck." And what was the genesis for doing it and the purpose in doing it?
The genesis really was some things I wrote when I was in Japan. I was as we've discussed, there for many months. And after the war, our occupation duties were not all that onerous. We were largely showing the flag in case of need, and the need never arose. But particularly on midwatches in the dead of night, there wasn't a great deal to do. I'd been accepted in Harvard Law School. I thought it would be a good idea if I learned how to type. And so I borrowed a yeoman's course book and taught myself how to type. And then I practiced by typing things. Sometimes they were my recollections about things, and sometimes they were letters home to my mother, who fortunately saved those letters. And those writings were really the basis of the book. And I later decided that it would be a good thing to turn them into some kind of a manuscript, and I did. And then my friends who had a look at it encouraged me to turn that into a book, which is.
And then it's a story really of it's a book about your experiences, yes, but more than that, other experiences of friends that you knew in the Kansas City area who went away to war at an earlier age, and you included them in the book.
That's
Very
right.
prominent number of people.
The subtitle is When Kansas Cityans Went to War.
Why don't you show us that? Ed's book is entitled The Pursuit of a Ruptured Duck When Kansas Cityans Went to War. And of course we all know that a ruptured duck was the prized discharge lapel pin. That's a beautiful cover picture. What is that, Ed?
That's a surrender scene aboard the USS New Jersey, and it was a picture taken.
USS Missouri?
I'm sorry, USS Missouri, a sister ship of the New Jersey. And the photographer was a native Kansas Cityan who achieved later great renown as a photographer. His name's David Douglas Duncan. And he took this picture. It was a great coup to be able to get aboard that ship and to be one of the reporters or photographers. So he has an archive of his works in Austin, Texas, part of the LBJ library down there. And I got a hold of him, got his permission to get this picture, and then they made it available to me, and I turned it into the cover of the book.
Beautiful.
That picture was in Kansas City. I mentioned having a few days leave on my way to the Pacific, and we went to a studio, and this is obviously my dad, and I'm wearing a proud wearer of my new ensign's uniform, and my dad obviously took great pride in that.
Just before the young ensign went to war, his Marine Corps World War I daddy, and Ed. Ed, when was this picture taken?
I was on Guam, and another fellow and I were driving around the island in a Jeep, and he took this picture of me standing there with my foot on the running board of the Jeep. And the Navy uniform in those days was gray and not khaki, and that's what I'm wearing.
Who are these two young guys?
Well, I'm the best looking one there.
Well, that's you on the left then.
Yes.
Who's the fellow on the right?
His name's Don Cheney. This was after I had joined the 5th Fleet staff. In the background, well, after I joined the 5th Fleet staff, and Don Cheney was a former border patrolman, as I recall. By that time, he was a lieutenant in the Navy and was also doing the same sort of thing I was in Flag Plot.
Looks like you're in the jungle there, or on the edge of it.
It was Guam.
Guam, yes. Now, Ed, are those regulation shoes?
Yeah, yes, they were. And you kind of slogged around those, and there was a lot of rain for a while on Guam. We waded around in the mud, and they were kind of high, ankle-high shoes.
Boondockers.
Boondockers, because you were in the boondocks.
Who's this fella, Ed?
This is Admiral Nimitz. When I left his staff, why, he gave me this inscribed picture. The ink has faded on the inscription below. As I recall, it's something about thanks for your services on my staff, words to that effect.
Mhm.
And that's,
And the same,
he, by the way, in that picture, he's signing a short snorter. And the fellows in the service will remember short snorters. You've got signatures of people on paper money and collected those, and that's something he was doing there.